Hello, everybody. So I haven't posted on Tales of Truth in a couple months. Been very busy, and but this video that I'm posting right now is part one of three. This is one of Armen's professors at Georgetown University, and he was our first interview. The very first interview when Armen and I started this channel. We're like, we need to get some experts on, some guests on, and we scheduled this guy. And then the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, uh, like within a week of doing this interview, that conflict, which started on September 27th, happened. And some of our later guests were more focused, their expertise was more focused on that conflict. So we figured it was appropriate to start with those interviews. And this one's still been in the can. So this is the longest interview we've done. It's an hour and a half, a little over an hour and a half, but I've broken it up into three parts. This is part one of three, so enjoy. Hey, Armen. Hello, Professor.
Hello.
Hey, Michael, how's it going?
Pretty good. I'm pretty excited about having our first guest on the show. Hello, everybody out there. We are finally, really getting into the rhythm here. We're kind of novices in our own right, but we've got experts coming on, and this is our first expert. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Armen to introduce our guest here.
Thanks, Michael. And I'm also very excited about today's show, and I'm sure you guys are as well. So the seventh episode of Hollywood and History kicks off the first of several interviews with what I think is already proving to be an all-star lineup comprised of both historians and people from showbiz. And our guest today is Professor James Shedel. He is a professor at the Department of History at Georgetown, where he teaches Central European history with a specialty in the Habsburg monarchy and Austro-Hungary. Professor Shedel completed his PhD at the University of Rochester. His research interests include the Austrian fin de siècle, that is the history of Austria-Hungary at the turn of the 20th century, and the role of monarchy in the process of modernization. He was a Fulbright Fellow for Austria, is currently on the editorial board for the Austrian History Yearbook, and a member of the official jury for the Austrian State Prize in History. And we are very happy to have you on board, Professor.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So during the introduction, I mentioned that you completed your PhD in New York State, but your roots actually go back to California, don't they?
Yes, in fact, the San Francisco Bay Area.
Right. I was wondering if you could perhaps tell us what drew you to history as a subject and to the history of the Habsburg Empire more specifically.
Well, I always liked history. I mean, even as a kid, I liked history movies. I liked ancient history in particular because my maternal grandfather was Greek. And so growing up, I had to know Greek mythology and ancient Greek history. And so things just developed from there, and I got interested in history in general. I used to read voraciously history books. And I got interested in Austria actually from cooking. I liked Austrian pastries. And I wanted to find out where these great pastries came from. And that led me to discover Vienna and Austria. And from pastries and cooking, I went into the serious history of Austria-Hungary and the Habsburgs.
All right, let me interject. So how old were you at the time when you were eating these pastries?
Oh, this would have been in junior high when I got my interest in Austria.
Professor, this is meant to be kind of a long-form conversation, and so I would imagine some people who are watching this may not necessarily know everything that there is about Austria-Hungary or Austrian pastry. So what makes Austrian pastry itself so special?
Well, of course, it's a matter of opinion, but in my opinion, it's the exactitude and the variety with which it's made. If you ever go to Vienna and go to any of the great Konditoreien, these bakeries that specialize in a very high level of baked goods and pastries, such as Daimels, for instance, which is the old court sugar baker, and is a big tourist attraction nowadays, you'll notice that when you look at a cake or a pastry, it appears to have been made with a protractor and compass. It's that. And the quality of the pastry is really second to none. I mean, you cannot produce a higher quality piece of pastry than what you find in a good Viennese pastry shop. You know, the filling, the crust, everything. So it's really an experience, both in terms of the eye and the tongue, to have a good Viennese pastry. Of course, one of them, the famous Sachertorte, is a big attraction in its own right when people go to Vienna. And in fact, the Hotel Sacher makes a substantial amount of its income from overcharging, I would say, for the street and for people sending it all over the world to their friends and relatives.
All right, say the name again.
Sachertorte.
Sachertorte?
Yeah, you get it from the Hotel Sacher, which is one of the 3 historic luxury hotels in Vienna.
All right, so you recommend that. Are there other pastries, particular styles of pastry that you would recommend if I found myself in Vienna?
Well, really, any of the cakes are excellent, and if you go into one of these pastry shops, generally you're going to find that most of what's on offer are slices of cake, along with some other pastries. So an Esterhazy torte, for instance, is very good. If the pastry shop has sort of a Hungarian connection, there's a pastry, a very rich chocolate pastry called a Rigorjanci. There are Punschtorten.
You're going to have to spell all these for me.
Punschtorte is it's basically the same way we would spell punch, except you add an S in front of the C. Yeah.
Got it.
There's also Fürst von Metternich Torte. That's a Prince Metternich cake, named after the famous Metternich from Austrian history. So there's just a huge variety that you can choose from, all of which are very rich. There's no such thing as a slimming Austrian pastry.
I'm practically just hankering for one right now, based on your description, Professor. So maybe we can use this to dovetail into the conversation that we spoke about a little bit earlier. Or maybe I can use this as a springboard into it. Did cuisine make the empire of the Habsburgs, or?
Well, what the cuisine represents is the historical diversity of the empire, and the way that the empire came together as an inheritance, and coupled with a minimal amount of conquest by the Habsburg dynasty, so that it amassed an empire of pieces, each of which had its own language, culture, and history. So the cuisine is a result of that diversity and that historical process of agglomeration, I guess you could say, with it all coming together in Vienna, which hosted really a polyglot culture, and that included the cooking.
Could you just give a quick rundown of what some of those separate cultures are that are part of the empire?
Okay. Well, to the north of Austria today, of course, is the Czech Republic and the Slovak republics.
That's where I hail from.
Okay, good. Then you have a connection. Excuse me, unfortunately, the phone rang.
No problem.
Yeah. So to the north was the Kingdom of Bohemia, which also involved Moravia and part of what is today the Slovak Republic. And so that's the Czech-speaking lands, with a large German minority in the southern and western parts, and to a lesser extent in Moravia. Then if you go further east, you run into the territory of Galicia and southern Poland, that Austria acquired in the 18th and early 19th centuries. So you had Polish-speaking population as well as Ruthenian, that is to say Ukrainian-speaking population, and a Yiddish-speaking population because Galicia had a large Jewish population, although not limited to Galicia. I mean, Jews could be found all over the empire. And then you go south into the Kingdom of Hungary, of course, with Magyar being spoken, and in the territory of Transylvania, which is also part of Hungary in those days, a very large Romanian population, along with a German minority. Go to the west in what used to be Yugoslavia. Now you had Slovenian, Croatian, and Serbian populations. And then you also, along the Adriatic and into the area that today is the Alto Adige in Italy, that of course had an Italian population, some of whom were in the southern Tyrol. Altogether, Austria had 11 nationalities. And of course, the German were at the center of Austria proper.
I mean, let's go into that in a little bit more detail, Professor. How exactly, because you're talking about this diversity which we witness, at least in the late 19th century, and perhaps 2 or 3 other empires in Europe with Russia and, of course, as our viewers will probably know at this time, of course, the Ottomans too. But how exactly did the Habsburg monarchs go about maintaining their hold over their domains for so long? And, to borrow a very popular phrase from the secondary literature on empire, manage difference within it. And I think it would also be helpful if you could put this in a temporal context. So when exactly can we say that the Habsburg Empire was founded, and when, of course, did it collapse?
Well, the Habsburgs enter into the territory that becomes what I'm calling the Habsburg monarchy and eventually Austria-Hungary in the 13th century when Rudolf I is elected Holy Roman Emperor. And at that time, Austria, what became the territories of contemporary Austria, was in a legal interregnum. That is, the previous dynasty, the Babenbergs, had died out. There had been attempts by different competing groups to lay claim to those territories, most notably the King of Bohemia. Ultimately, that claim was discounted because he had not sought the legal presentation of those lands from the emperor, since Bohemia was part of the Holy Roman Empire. And Rudolf decided that those lands ought to go to him and his family. So after reclaiming them, he gave them to his sons. And that established the Habsburgs as the ruling dynasty in Austria. They had one more stretch of time on the imperial throne with one of Rudolf's sons, but that was a disputed reign. After his death, actually a murder at the hands of a member of the family, the Habsburgs don't regain the imperial throne until the 14th century. But in the interim, the family was very ambitious, and they consolidate their power in Austria. They compete with their neighbors, with the Hungarian crown and the Bohemian crown, and ultimately, as I say, regained the imperial title, and also, in the meantime, elevated their status artificially. And by that I mean that one of the Habsburgs, excuse me, creates the title of Archduke based on forged documents and basically just a lot of chutzpah that the Habsburgs had a special status that elevated them among normal dukes and put them sort of just below the King of Bohemia and the Holy Roman Emperor in status. Now, no one accepted this as a legal reality, but also nobody really challenged it. So the Habsburgs continued to rule it, and then when they regain the imperial title, and this takes place now, I'm talking about the late 15th century we are in, with the second of the new Habsburgs to be taking it after the 13th century. The title is made official by the then Habsburg Emperor, Frederick. And so the title of Archduke becomes really a Habsburg trademark. There are no other archdukes in Central Europe. And in the family, the males in the immediate family bear the title of archdukes. So that's a Habsburg trademark, and that is their sort of overarching title to the Austrian lands. Austria was never a kingdom. You know, what we consider Austria today was a patchwork of feudal holdings with different titles associated to the families that inherited it. And if you ever look at the list of titles associated with Franz Josef, you know, it is this sort of arm's length title or list of titles, and it includes all the titles that go with each of what today we would consider the provinces of Austria, with Archduke as sort of the overarching thing. But since the Habsburgs retain the title of Holy Roman Emperor from the 15th century forward, except for one little period in the 18th century during the War of the Austrian Succession, when the Wittelsbachs get it for a few years, the imperial status is also associated with the family. Now, backtracking from this whole question of titles, the family acquires the bulk of their territory through clever marriages, most notably with Maximilian I's marriage to the heiress of Burgundy, which gave the Habsburgs, who up until that time were relatively poor as European nobility go, access to an enormous fortune. Also to a status high enough that they could aspire to start marrying into important families, that is, important ruling families.
Right.
And from Maximilian, they are able to marry into the House of Spain. And Maximilian's two sons, Charles and Ferdinand, end up being the beneficiaries of this clever marriage diplomacy. And Charles inherits the burgeoning Spanish Empire, becomes Holy Roman Emperor as Charles V. Ferdinand gets the Central European holdings, that is Austria. And ultimately, again, through a marriage contract, after the death of the King of Hungary, who also was King of Bohemia at the Battle of Mohacs with the Ottomans, the Habsburgs have a claim to the thrones of Hungary and Bohemia, which they eventually make good, although shortly, that is within a relatively short amount of time, a few years, they lose most of Hungary because the Ottomans conquer it. But nonetheless, they always have that claim to the Hungarian throne. And so they become kings of Hungary and kings of Bohemia, as well as holding on to the title of Holy Roman Emperor and Austrian Archdukes and all the other titles that go with it. So that really creates the core of the empire, are these inheritances.
I have to ask you a question. So my grandfather or my great grandfather was an immigrant. Came through Ellis Island, settled in Pennsylvania. And I mean, when I was born, I was told I was Czechoslovakian because there was such a place as Czechoslovakia. But
Right.
then I realized, or it came to be, that I'm not a Czech, I'm a Slovak, because that all split up. But my grandfather referred to us by the term bohunk. Are you familiar with that term, bohunk?
Yeah, I've heard it, but my understanding of that term is that that's a derogatory term.
That's why he would use that. That's why he used it for ourselves.
It doesn't have any any lineage in Central Europe.
So it doesn't refer to Bohemian Hungarian?
Well, I think that's what it's supposed to be, is this idea that you're divided between Bohemia and Hungary, but it's not a Central European term that I know of. It's an American term.
Got it.
Like calling somebody a Polak.
Got it. Right. So it's a derogatory ethnic slur, I guess.
Yeah, really.
Got it. It's okay. You could call me a bohunk. It's fine.
I'll call you a bohunk.
Fine. All right. Sorry to interrupt.
Well, that's okay. So the Habsburgs really from the from the 16th century forward, after they've gotten the Spanish inheritance and the Central European inheritance, you could call it, really become major players in European history. Every major war practically involved the Habsburgs in some way. And their influence also extends well beyond their inherited territories, that is the core territories, we could call them, into Italy, for instance. And they're involved in all the major issues in East Central Europe. And of course, they are the main bulwark against the advance of the Ottoman Turks. The sort of thin strip of what comes to be called Royal Hungary that's in Habsburg hands after the advance of the Ottomans becomes essentially a buffer zone that's fortified with garrisons and fortresses to keep the Ottomans in check and have, as I say, a buffer between them and the main territories of the Habsburgs and the Holy Roman Empire. Plus, the Habsburgs had a claim as kings of Hungary to Transylvania, which remained autonomous even during the period of Ottoman dominance in what had been the Hungarian kingdom. So the Habsburgs are really wearing several hats, you might say, in terms of European affairs. Big players in all of the power politics of Europe and the main defenders of European Christendom, as people thought of it at the time, against the advance of the Islamic Ottoman Turkish Empire.
I mean, clearly they are, and again, just what exactly is the glue that holds this empire together, Professor? What exactly is it that the monarchs are able to summon up from the peoples that they are ruling to maintain that loyalty over centuries, as you're clearly...
Well, I mean, in the first instance, you have to remember that dynasticism is based on two things. First, it's the ability of the family to make good their claims and have the political skill to sustain themselves and to advance their interests as a political force. And you can see that in the way the Habsburgs were able to acquire and hold on to territory on that basis. The other thing about a dynastic state is the cultural force that stands behind their legitimacy. And by that I mean, first of all, the church and the idea that their legitimacy in the first instance, as was the case with all dynasties in Europe at the time in the early modern period, is legitimated by God and his institutional representative in whatever Christian church we're talking about. Of course, in the Habsburg case, it's the Catholic Church, which also represented the majority version of Christianity in their realms. But along with that goes a concept of loyalty to the ruling house, which is based on not only the fact that God has already given his approbation by having them in power in the first place, but also legally, subjects and vassals of a higher order, like the nobility and the church itself, have a legal obligation to obedience to their rulers, which is further reified by the tradition of obedience in a hierarchical social and political order in which all levels of society are interlocked by, at least in theory, a mutual obligation to one another that goes from the peasant all the way up to the ruler. Now, of course, there are also practical considerations. You know, revolts are not unheard of. Disobedience is not unheard of. You also have to use force. You've got to be able to muster the physical means of holding on to power. So all of these things fit together. And what's also interesting about the Habsburgs, however, is that in the mid-18th century, when the hold of the Habsburgs on their territories is challenged after the death of the last male, direct male of the family, results in the succession of a woman, Maria Theresia, as inheritor of the Habsburg lands. Although her father had spent most of his reign getting members of the family, all of the elites within the empire itself, and all of the neighboring states that had an interest in possibly claiming territory, not to mention other more distant courts, to sign on to a treaty known as the Pragmatic Sanction, in which all of the signatories undertook to respect the integrity of the Habsburg inheritance and not to challenge a woman's right to inherit those territories, i.e. Maria Theresia.
And
What was this time period? When was this?
He comes to the throne in 1740.
and this is something which the Habsburg Empire almost becomes famous for, right? In the 18th century, this notion of the Rechtsstaat, or the well-ordered state.
Well, that comes out of the crisis that's provoked by Maria Theresia's succession.
Yeah.
Because, she's barely warmed her seat on the throne when her neighbors, significantly Prussia, joined by Bavaria ultimately and several other states, decide that, well, she's not really the legitimate successor, and that certain Habsburg territories really belong in their states. So,
And this is purely because of her gender, right?
well, yeah, that's the opportunity that's taken on that basis. And the first one to violate it is Frederick the Great, who himself had just come to the throne. And ironically, prior to attacking Austria, he had published a book called Anti-Machiavel, in which he rejected Machiavellian politics and had presented himself as somebody who believed in international law and the sanctity of treaties. And so he immediately breaks international law and the sanctity of treaties by claiming Silesia, which was adjacent to his lands, and attacking Austria. He then tried to get back all the copies of his book.
He regretted it.
Save his reputation. And that attack launched other attacks and became what's known as the War of the Austrian Succession, in which, although Austria loses the Silesian territory and for a few years loses the title of emperor, I should point out that Maria Theresia, of course, could not be a Holy Roman Emperor. She had a husband, Charles of Lorraine, who ultimately becomes Holy Roman Emperor. So actually, from Maria Theresia forward, technically we should be talking about the House of Habsburg-Lorraine, because, as I said, her father was the last male in the direct line. The only other branch that still had males, which had died out just before him, had been in Spain. The Habsburgs had, up until the War of the Spanish Succession, hoped that they were going to inherit the Spanish branch. But unfortunately, Louis XIV's war over the succession resulted in the Bourbons getting the Spanish throne. So after that war, the Habsburgs become firmly a Central European dynasty, although they also have interests in Italy, but they're precisely associated with Central Europe. So anyway, I'm sorry for the diversion. I just thought I should make something clear there.
No, that's fascinating.
The result of the War of the Austrian Succession forces the empire to modernize itself, to catch up to its powerful neighbors, especially militarily. But to be up to date militarily, you needed more money. To get more money, in the Austrian case, the central authority, the empress and the emperor, had to assert their authority more effectively over the constituent parts of the state, all of these different kingdoms and principalities and so forth, but particularly over Bohemia and Hungary, and over the nobility generally, in order to extract more money, so that you could have a powerful army that can ward off enemies. And in the process of doing that, this forced an extension of power from the center and a modernization of the whole bureaucratic structure, and bringing in new people to advise Maria Theresia and to create this new, more effective structure. So the upshot is that by the end of her reign in 1780, Austria has a much more effective central bureaucracy. It's better able to tap the resources of its far-flung territories. It has more control over its constituent parts. The only place where that control is not as extensive as the center would like it to have been is Hungary, which is always an ongoing problem. The Hungarians hold on to their own sense of autonomy and their rights within the empire. But also what has happened is that in this restructuring, the people who have been brought in to accomplish this end are for the most part representative of the new rationalist and Enlightenment view of the world, which involves the state being more than simply a military force that protects the territorial integrity of its lands, and more than the ruler just being a kind of extended version of a Christian good shepherd, and the state not taking a very active role in the lives of its subjects. But instead, the Enlightenment saw the state as the institution that should be responsible for improving the lives of the subject, advancing human knowledge and human well-being. In other words, being a force in the broader sense of progress. And the way that this is enshrined in the state and its bureaucratic structure is through the idea of the Rechtsstaat, the state based on the rule of law. That law is the way that you can enshrine these progressive Enlightenment rational principles and express the state's responsibility to be a force for good in the lives of the subject.
And how long was her reign?
It's 1740 to 1780, but from 1760 to 1780, she's ruling in tandem with her eldest son, Joseph II, who comes to the throne in 1780 and dies in 1790. But in his 10 years, he really pushes the idea of the role of the Enlightenment in the state and the state's right and obligation to rule within this legal structure, this notion of the Rechtsstaat, and to be a force for good. Now, of course, it's also a way of extending the power of the state at the expense of the old feudal elites, who are seen as, an impediment or a holdover from a less enlightened time, and whose position in the state and society is weakened in order, first of all, in theory, to expand the benefits of enlightened rule, but also to expand the power of the state, of the central authority. So by the death of Joseph II, you could say that Habsburg power rests on two foundations. On the one hand, it has the traditional religious, dynastic concept of social and political hierarchy that culminates in the ruler and his or her authority. On the other hand, it now has a more modern legitimation based on the most advanced theories about the state and society and the rule of law that existed. So the Habsburgs basically embrace modernity from the middle of the 18th century forward.
So it's a distinct paradigm shift, and it's fascinating that it happened with a female reign.
Yeah.
Are there movies on that? I mean, has anybody done that's? I could see there's so many historical period Netflix style series. I'm like, as you're talking, I see the drama unfolding.
There's no movie that I know of. I mean, Maria Theresia, is a very prominent figure in sort of Austrian tradition and folk mythology, and she's very favorably viewed in Austrian history.
And what was her title? What was she referred to as?
She was called the Empress.
The Empress.
Although technically she was never crowned Empress. But she always had that title. And then she had other titles, of course.
There's the title of the show, The Empress.
Yeah. And she was Queen of Bohemia and female king of Hungary.
Got it.